Today we are looking at aggregate supply and the short-run aggregate supply curve. Aggregate again meaning the sum of or average, and so we will be looking today, as I said, on the supply side, and the previous lesson was on the demand side. So note that we do have a short-run aggregate supply curve referred to as SAS. See that here. And we are showing it curved here, but in our diagrams we'll show it as a straight line. I'd like to emphasize that you will be seeing a long-run aggregate supply curve as well, so please note the short-run aspect of this. The short run and the long run in macroeconomics, it's a little bit different than theory of the firm. In the short run in macroeconomics, it's the period of time during which the nominal prices of resources, and particularly wages, do not change in response to changes in the price level. So in other words, the factor costs remain constant. So we're going to have things happen in the economy. For example, we might have aggregate demand that's increased and we're producing more, but in the short run, we haven't yet had time for the nominal price, meaning the current prices of resources such as wages, they haven't yet changed. So we've had something happen in the economy, like a change in aggregate demand, an increase, but wages have not yet adjusted. In the long run, however, it's a period of time in which nominal prices, so in current year prices, of all resources, including wages, do change so as to reflect fully any changes in the price level. So again, if we had, as an example, an increase in aggregate demand, we have an increase in output, unemployment goes down, what we're going to find on future slides is that we're going to demonstrate that wages will actually in turn go up. Now that's going to be in the long run because that's where the prices of resources such as wages have changed. It's upward sloping, just like we see in micro, and you could see it referred to as the short run aggregate supply. I tend to just use SAS for short run aggregate supply. Note again, because we're macro, on the y-axis we don't say price, we say price level. And on the x-axis you can either say real GDP or you could say output. Do not say quantity. So note that the distinction between the short run and the long run in macroeconomics does not, however, affect aggregate demand. We don't have a short run aggregate demand and a long run aggregate demand, nor do we have aggregate demand changing as we move from short run to long run. So one aggregate demand, but we will have two aggregate supply curves. So we'll see that we have the upward sloping curve for the short run aggregate supply, and we will see that we have a vertical line for the long run aggregate supply, which we will go into more detail later. So the now being the upward sloping short run, and the long run being the vertical long run aggregate supply. So aggregate supply defined. Again, key definition, do commit this one to memory. Aggregate supply is the total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy at different price levels, ceteris paribus. So you can see from the photos, it can be very varied, but it's all the supply that's happening out there added together into one supply curve. There can be important factors that we'll look at that cause the SRAS or SAS curve to shift. Typically, we can look at changes in firms' costs of production and sudden events called supply shocks, which we'll look at. So SAS shift. So we'll look at various things that are going to make this curve shift. First one being changes in wages. Wages are quite a large component of any manufacturing activity, so it tends to be really quite a major element for these shifts. So wage changes can significantly shift the SRAS curve since wages constitute a major portion of firms' costs. And wages can change for a number of reasons. We might have changes in minimum wage legislation, which we've already looked at in micro. Or we could have changes achieved through labor union bargaining, where let's say a union is bargaining up the wages. If nominal, which means in current year prices, if nominal wages increase, with the price level constant, a firm's costs in production will rise, just like in micro, because it's become now more expensive for the company to produce. So resulting in a leftward shift in the SAS curve. Changes in non-labor resource prices. Anything that's required for the input of manufacturing would certainly be relevant here. So changes in the price of non-labor resources. So we could have things like the price of oil. And the reason we say oil is key for so many industries, because remember, we're looking on a macro level of what's going to affect all across the economy. So oil is used for transportation, it's used for manufacturing, so it has got a macro impact. So changes in the price of oil, equipment, capital goods, which are what we use to produce goods and services, land inputs, or any other resource impact upon the SAS curve in the same way as changes in wages. And you'll know this already from your experience in micro, that these shifts are going to happen in the same manner. So an increase in the price of a key resource, which makes the cost of producing more expensive, will shift the SAS curve to the left, just like in micro. A decrease in the price, so it's become less expensive now to produce, is going to shift the SAS curve to the right. A change in the price of imports. Now this one is really key. We often think that imports are simply going to affect us personally as consumers. Oh, it's more expensive now to buy that French cheese or the Italian clothes and so on and so forth. But if imports are used as raw materials, or if you're importing machines, which is capital, for production, then it's going to impact firms and their cost of production will increase. So a rise in import prices will increase the cost of production if the imports are used as raw materials or as capital, meaning equipment. And this can happen to a change in the country's exchange rate. So I'm recording this right now, March 1st, 2015. Our Canadian dollar, just as an example, is very, very low right now. And so it's all in the news now of how the cost of imports are going to increase. And that's food, it's clothing, it's going to be raw materials, it's going to be a host of things that are really going to impact our economy quite significantly. So this is definitely an example of how the change in the exchange rate can affect import prices. Another factor is changes in business taxes. So business taxes are taxes on firms' profits, and they're treated by firms like costs of production. So if taxes go up, it's as if the cost to produce has gone up. So higher taxes on profits are equivalent to increases in production costs, and so shift the SAS curve to the left. Changes in business subsidies. Subsidies are often referred to as a negative tax. They have the opposite effect to taxes, as they involve money transferred from the government to firms. So subsidies are also viewed as ways to lower the cost of production. So if subsidies increase, the SAS curve shifts to the right, because it's as if your costs of production have gone down. And if subsidies decrease, the SAS curve shifts to the left. And now supply shocks. So there's sudden events that have sudden and strong impact on short-run aggregate supply. So what could have something that's really quite profound and sudden? It could be war or violent conflict. It could be unfavorable weather. Think of the ice storms we've had, or droughts and so on. A sudden increase in the price of oil, so a sudden spike. A major oil discovery, or good weather conditions. It doesn't always have to be bad things. So what we're going to do now is look at diagrams and see the impact of each of the following events on the short-run aggregate supply curve. And we'll explain what happens to the SRAS in each case. So the price of oil, an important input in production, increases. So now it's become more expensive to produce. So we will produce less at every price level. So the SRAS curve will shift to the left. Show the horizontal arrows. And we'll call this 2. Below zero temperatures during a large part of the growing seasons destroys agricultural output. So we've got less being produced at every price point. So SRAS must shift to the left. Again, these should be parallel lines. Unfortunately, I can't use, or I haven't figured out how to use, a ruler on the computer. The government lowers taxes on firms' profits. So because the taxes are now lower, it has become as if input costs have gone down. When input costs go down, the SRAS curve shifts to the right. The government eliminates subsidies on agricultural products. So if the subsidies are eliminated, it will now become more expensive to produce. In that case, it shifts to the left. Short-run equilibrium, level of prices and output. So in terms of the equilibrium, it's going to be very similar to micro. The equilibrium level of real GDP occurs when aggregate demand intersects aggregate supply, just like in micro when we have supply and demand intersecting. In the short run, it's given by the point of intersection of the AD curve and the SRAS curve. This is going to determine the price level, the level of real GDP, and the level of employment that prevail when the economy is in this short-run equilibrium. Now, the reason employment is linked with the level of real GDP is if real GDP increases and we're producing more, we'll need more workers, unemployment goes down. If the level of real GDP decreases and we produce less, we'll need fewer workers and unemployment goes up. So the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, nothing terribly exciting. Intersection of AD and SRAS being here. Here is the price level. And careful, do not call this Q. It's Y for national income and the equilibrium. Changes in the short-run equilibrium. The short-run equilibrium position of an economy changes whenever there's a change in aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply. So we see that, let's see, our original position is here. Let's call this A. And if we initially have an increase in aggregate demand, then we've gone from A to B. And then if we have an increase in aggregate supply, we've gone from B to C. And so these can be short changes in the short-run equilibrium. Now we're going to introduce the concept of the long-run aggregate supply curve, and you'll see that it is vertical. When all three curves intersect, so the LAS, the SAS, and the AD curve right here, this one we'll tell you why later, but this is the equilibrium at the natural rate of unemployment or the equilibrium at the full rate of employment, which again we will address either this presentation or in a future presentation. But this is now the long run equilibrium. The long run aggregate supply curve represents potential GDP. So this is sort of like the PPF, where all of a country's resources are being used efficiently and where unemployment is at its what we're going to call its natural rate. It's also referred to as long-term because there will be short-run fluctuations which we're going to examine, which are going to move the economy away from this long-run equilibrium. It could go to the left, it could go to the right, and these will be part of what you know as the business cycles or fluctuations. But you're going to see that there's always going to be forces that pull the economy back towards this equilibrium, this long-run equilibrium. And this long-run equilibrium is vertical because it's believed by some that output is based on the quality and quantity of the factors of production and not on the price level. So in other words, we're going to have this level of output that represents potential GDP where all of the country's resources are being used efficiently, and this is independent of price. We simply have the resources that we have, we can produce what we can produce, and price can be higher or lower, but it is independent of price. It's really driven by how many resources do we have. So let's look at a scenario where Canadians save more. So we've got this long-run equilibrium. If Canadians save more, we're going to have them spending less. So aggregate demand will shift to the left. And I'll just show you where we're heading with these diagrams because we'll come back to it in a few drawings, but we'll call this AD2. We've got a new level of output. We'll call this Y2 and this one YN. We can see that output has decreased. We've got a new level of price level, it's PE. We can see that the price level has dropped. And we are in right now a short run fluctuation because LAS and SAS and AD are not all intersecting with each other. So this is a short run situation. And again, we will be covering this many times. We're going to look at something called a recessionary or deflationary gap, and also an inflationary gap. This has to do when aggregate demand has shifted. So AD shifts. Do not confuse this with SAS shifting. Okay. So we're going to have a situation where real GDP is less than potential GDP. That was actually on the previous slide if you look at that, but we'll come back to this and we'll annotate some other slides. So when real GDP is less than potential GDP, the economy is experiencing a recessionary gap, also known as a deflationary gap. You can think of it as the economy being a balloon. And if there's not enough aggregate demand, it's as if the balloon has deflated, hence the deflationary gap. And it's not at its full potential. In this case, unemployment is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. So in other words, there's not enough total demand, and I want to emphasize the fact that we are dealing with demand in this type of gap. There's not enough total demand in the economy to make it worthwhile for firms to produce potential GDP. So in other words, AD has shifted left. We're also going to look at something called an inflationary gap. And again, I want to emphasize that it's AD that shifts and causes this, not SAS. When real GDP is larger than potential GDP, the economy is experiencing an inflationary gap, and unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment. So in this case, there is too much demand in the economy, and the firms respond by producing a greater quantity of real GDP than potential GDP. And AD has shifted right. So let's look at these recessionary and inflationary gaps with our new model now. So we've looked at the scenario of Canadians saving more. We know that AD will then shift to the left. Call this AD2. Here's our new point of equilibrium. We are in a recessionary gap. Excuse me. And if we want to show this recessionary gap, it is going to be the distance in this triangle from the point of intersection and the LAS curve. So recessionary or deflationary gap. And I would like to emphasize it's because AD has shifted. Shift left. A cut in personal taxes. Okay, so if personal taxes have been cut, people will have more money to spend, and so aggregate demand will shift to the right with the arrows, AD2. So now, because we are operating to the right of the LAS, we now have an inflationary gap. And if we wanted to show the inflationary gap, again, it's the distance from our intersection to the LAS curve. And here is the inflationary gap. And again, AD shifted right. And it's AD that's the key player. Lower interest rates. If we have lower interest rates, we know that firms will borrow more, and we know that consumers will borrow more, and this is a component of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand being C plus G plus I plus X minus M. So C for consumer spending will go up, and I for investments by firms will go up. So AD shifts to the right. And our new point of intersection, what kind of a gap is this? If we're operating to the right of the LAS and we are operating below the natural rate of unemployment, we have an inflationary gap. Exports increase. Again, exports are a component of AD. D2. We're operating to the right of the LAS. And so what kind of gap is this? Again, it's an inflationary gap. And it's important to note that it's AD that shifted. Okay, so looking at this all together, the long run and short run together, AD, SAS, and LAS curves. So we know that right now we're in a long run equilibrium. Everything is intersecting. The full employment level of real GDP. This is when LAS, AD, and SAS are going to be all intersecting at the same point, and we're in the long run equilibrium. And it's going to be where the economy is producing its potential GDP because we're producing at the LAS, and unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. The full employment level of real GDP is the level of real GDP in which there's no recessionary or inflationary gaps. So if you think of the previous slide, we had AD, SAS, and LAS all intersecting at the same point. We didn't have AD and SAS intersecting to the left, where we would have a recessionary gap, and we didn't have AD and SAS intersecting to the right of LAS, where we would have an inflationary gap. So in other words, they're all intersecting at the same point. If we look at a situation called stagflation, we have both high unemployment and high inflation. So let's say we have a rise in input costs. We have a rise in input costs. Now we have SAS shifts to the left. SAS2. And if we look at what's happening here, we've got a decrease in output. We've got an increase in the price level. So here we have price is up, price level is up. We have output is down, and we have unemployment is up. We have a very unhappy situation where we have high unemployment and high inflation. Now, the reason it's called stagflation, the flation obviously from inflation, and the stag part from like a stagnant. Think of a stagnant pool that's dying and smelly and so on. So the economy is in a dismal state, is producing less, it's stagnating, plus we have inflation. This is not a desirable situation. Now we've seen some of this already. We've shifted at least one time the SAS, but shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve can also contribute to economic fluctuations. But when the SAS curve is fluctuating, we're not going to call them inflationary and deflationary gaps. So please keep that in mind. That's only when AD shifts. A fall in SARS will give rise to an economic contraction because we'll be producing less. So we have with real GDP falling and an increase in unemployment. Note, however, yes, as I said, that this differs from a recessionary gap where it's only aggregate demand. This special set of circumstances is especially undesirable. This is the one that we looked at with stagflation. It leads to the simultaneous appearance of two problems: economic contraction with unemployment and a rising price level. And as we said, this combination of events has been termed stagflation, combining stagnation with inflation. So stagflation's silver lining. So let's have now a decrease in input costs. Okay, if we're going to decrease input costs, then SAS will shift to the right. Call this SAS2. And we'll have this YE. This becomes Y2. This is PE. This will become P2. So if we look at what's happening, we've got the price level is down, so prices are falling. We have output is up, and we have unemployment is down. So if we look at it, prices are going down and unemployment's going up, this is a particularly desirable situation. And this is a situation that governments are often trying to promote. So you'll see them giving research and development credits. You'll see them giving tax credits for technology. They are, in essence, trying to get a decrease in input costs, knowing that this is fantastic, that prices are dropping and unemployment is dropping at the same time. So an increase in short-run aggregate supply gives rise to an economic expansion as real GDP increases, and so then we know that we need more workers, and unemployment falls. So the economy is experiencing two desirable developments: economic expansion and increasing employment with a falling price level. So we're going to look at different scenarios, and you're going to use the appropriate diagram to show change in short-run equilibrium. I want to emphasize the short run at this point, including the impacts on the equilibrium price level, output, and unemployment. The reason it's going to be short-run equilibrium is that we're going to be shifting away from the long-run equilibrium, and we haven't yet had the forces pulling us back to the long-run equilibrium, being the LAS curve. So we're calling this short run because this is what initially has happened in the economy. So firms are pessimistic about the future of the economy. If firms are pessimistic, they're going to rein in their spending and be very conservative. So we'll have SAS shifts to the left. So if this is YN, the natural rate of unemployment, this is PE, got P2. Oops, our new point of intersection is here. We have Y2, So we can see that the price level has gone up. We see that output has gone down. If output has gone down, then we know we need fewer workers, so unemployment has gone up. We know this is not a good situation, and we have stagflation. We want to keep firms happy and confident about the future. There's a fall in the price of oil, a major input in production. So if the price of oil has gone down, our costs of production have gone down, and firms will expand. This is Yn. We now have Y2. So output has increased. PE. We now have P2. Price level has gone down. So price level is down. We have output up. And so we have unemployment down. A very happy situation. The significant rise in stock market prices. Okay, so this is a little bit of a tricky question. When stock market prices rise, individuals will feel wealthier. They will be wealthier because they'll be holding on to assets, being the stocks that are worth more. When stock market prices increase, it doesn't necessarily affect firms at all. It's really only sort of the ownership of the firms, and the owners become wealthier. It doesn't necessarily free up money for the firms, although in some circumstances it can. But we're going to really look at initially the major impact is that consumers feel that they are wealthier, and when people are wealthier, they will spend more. So consumer spending is part of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand increases. BD2. This is Yn. This becomes Y2. This becomes P2. All right, so here we have the price level is up. Output is up. But unemployment is down. So we have an inverse relationship here between prices going up and unemployment going down. So we've got anyway, just drawing your attention to this, we'll be examining this further in the future. Because it was a shift in aggregate demand, and here is our new point of intersection. Are we operating to the left or to the right of LAS? We're operating to the right, so our unemployment is beneath or below the natural rate of unemployment. And do we have an inflationary or deflationary gap? Well, because we're to the right, we have an inflationary gap, and we can refer to that because it was a shift in AD. A war destroys a portion of an economy's physical capital. Okay, this is a bit of a red herring question, but if we have less capital, we will know that the SAS curve will shift to the left because we'll have fewer tools and machines and so on. So SAS has shifted to the left. But then also, do we have fewer factors of production now that it's been destroyed? So we can think of a PPF, it would shift inwards, but we also have less potential in the economy, so the LAS curve has also shifted to the left. And so our new point of equilibrium is here. And so what has happened compared to our original? If this is Yn, and this becomes, we'll call it Y2, and P1, P2, well, we certainly have output is down, unemployment is up, and price level is up. And the assignment is here, but it's also posted on Blackboard, where you have spaces to fill in your answers, and the graphs are drawn for you. Thank you.